Emblem Marth specializes in evasion tanking, dealing with armored foes, and attacking multiple times. Wearing his ring grants boosts to strength, dexterity, and speed, all the stats a combat unit wants, along with his sync skills. The starting one, Perceptive, incentivizes attacking enemies on the player phase by granting plus 15 avoid, and sometimes a little more. Since you won't get this on the enemy phase, use this against dangerous foes that you can't afford to take a hit from. At Bond level 3, he gains Break Defenses, which allows his equipper an additional attack if they break the foe. The break mechanic is introduced next chapter, but like Perceptive, it only applies to the player phase. Against an enemy you have weapon triangle advantage against, this extra attack might be enough to turn a 2-round kill into a 1-round kill. Then at Bond level 7, you get Unyielding, which heals you if your HP is below 20% at the start of a turn. This is mostly useful in conjunction with Perceptive and some of Marth's other abilities to turn his holder into an evasion tank. When you choose to engage with Marth for 3 turns, you gain access to Divine Speed. Think of this as Break Defenses, except it's always active, and it stacks with that, giving you up to 2 additional attacks. Again, useful if you need just a bit more damage to finish an enemy. Once per engage, you can use Marth's Lodestar Rush, which launches 7 consecutive attacks at 30% damage. It's only usable with swords and only if you're directly adjacent to the enemy. In the early game, this is a delete one enemy button, so use this when you can against troublesome opponents to wipe them off the map before they can hurt you. As enemies get stronger, they're much less likely to be finished off by Lodestar Rush, but you never get counterattacked when using this skill, making it great for wearing down tough enemies like bosses at no risk to yourself. Every Emblem's Engage skill and Engage attack gets special bonuses depending on the equipper's class type. For Marth, dragons heal damage from their Divine Speed attack, while covert units inflict poison with this. Poison in Engage doesn't damage enemies, it's a static debuff that increases damage they take for every stack of poison. And this really adds up when, say, hitting multiple times. Covert units are naturally adept at evade tanking, so they synergize well with Marth's other abilities too. For Lodestar Rush, dragons hit 9 times instead of 7, backup classes hit 8 times, and mystical units deal damage based on magic. Many emblems have bonuses with classes you might not think to try them on to encourage outside-the-box tactics. So experiment and see what works for you. While engaged with an emblem, you can also use their engaged weapons, regardless of the weapons your class would normally be able to equip. For example, Vander could use these while engaged despite not normally having access to swords. The rapier is the one anyone has access to, and it's a pretty good one. The game doesn't tell you this, but it provides plus 20 avoid while equipped, which stacks very well with Perceptive. But it also has effectiveness against armored and cavalry enemies. The armored one is significant because in Engage, armored enemies are very tough and effective weapons or mages are the only practical way to kill them, making Marth one of your only answers to them in the early chapters. So make sure you send Marth's user to wherever the armored enemies are located. At Bond rank 10, the highest that an emblem can achieve right now, Marth gains the Mercurius, which is a bit stronger than the Rapier, though a lot heavier, but while equipped, it doubles all experience gained. Mercurius gives Marth another use on top of the rest of his kit: snowballing early game characters. If you have somebody that you would really like to make good, get them to Bond 10 with Marth ASAP and have them use Mercurius. Their levels will go crazy, and by the mid-game, they'll be well ahead of the rest of the curve. Early access to Marth and Mercurius snowballing is actually one of the biggest assets the early joining characters in Engage have over the later ones, so if you really like someone in the starting chapters, I would recommend trying this out with them. An important thing to note about Marth is he is locked to Alir until chapter 4, but this does make Alir the biggest powerhouse you have until then. After that point, give Marth to somebody that you want to make an evasion tank out of, someone who needs just a little more damage to finish off enemies, or someone you want to level up quickly. Among Marth's sync skills, Perceptive and Unyielding are very cheap to inherit, but Break Defenses, the one you really want, is far more expensive. His stat-boosting inheritable skills focus on evasion. The thing about these skills is, you can't say stack avoid plus 10 and avoid plus 15. If you buy a higher tier of one of these, it automatically replaces the lower tier version. But having an avoid boost all the time makes someone an even better user of Marth, or they can start dodge tanking without him. Marth's weapon bonus inheritance is the Sword Agility line, which raise Avoid even further at a cost of -10 crit when using a sword. Notice how this -10 crit penalty never increases at higher tiers of this skill, while the Avoid bonus will keep going up. Honestly, the crit penalty is not that bad unless you're specifically going for a crit build. Finally, Marth's only provided proficiency for promotions, that's a lot of P's, is swords, obviously. Marth's final bonuses are +3 strength, +4 dex, and +4 speed. A bit less speed than I'd like, but that's more Lynn's job. Unyielding upgrades to restoring 30% HP at Bond 12 and 40% HP at Bond 18, while at Bond 16, Perceptive upgrades to its plus version, giving +30 avoid at base, with an additional 1 avoid every 4 points of speed, making Marth's user an even better player phase dodge tank. And at Bond 15, remember the falchion Alir had access to in the Premonition? Well, we can finally use it for real. 12 might is a little low, but dragon effectiveness becomes fell dragon effectiveness via the 13th emblem we just got. And the final boss is, well, that should be obvious. At higher levels, Marth's sync skills are incredibly cheap to inherit, though there's a lot more competition for skill slots this late in the game, so they might not see use. On the more expensive side are Sword Agility and the Avoid Plus skills. These can make sword users almost unhittable, though their offense may suffer slightly. I personally find that even now, Marth's best assets are Divine Speed and Break Defenses, which were still available below Bond 10. But if you're planning on taking Marth to endgame, you may as well unlock his higher levels for the stat boosts. Emblem Sigurd is all about movements, and in a grid-based strategy game, movement is one of the most important things. He boosts his holders' dexterity, defense, and build while worn. The boost to build is particularly nice, it's something not a lot of emblems have. But what's also nice is, regardless of bond level, he also boosts move by 1. His first sync skill is Canter, which allows his unit to move 2 extra spaces after... and this is weird, but bear with me. Any action that would normally give you experience points. This means you can canter after attacking or using a staff, but not after using an item. Canter will still trigger for these types of actions even if circumstances stop you from gaining experience. Either you're at level 20 or it's the Fell Xenologue. Also note that the canter move is slowed down by terrain. Unlike similar abilities in earlier Fire Emblem games, this isn't using up your leftover movement. This is always an extra 2 spaces, regardless of how long or short your move was. At Bond 3, he gains Momentum. This boosts the damage of your first attack during combat by 1 for every space you moved before attacking, up to a maximum of 10. But plus 10 damage, especially early on, is insane, and it's not hard to reach that bonus with Sigurd's insane movements. At Bond 7, you get Headlong Rush. A simple skill, it makes you immune to the freeze status, which is inflicted by the freeze staff. Let's just say you are going to want it in Chapter 11. All of that is just while synced with Sigurd. When engaged, you activate his skill Gallop, which is incredibly simple. It just gives +5 to movements, +6 if you're a dragon, and +7 if you're cavalry. Covert units, on the other hand, stick with the +5, but gain the ability to ignore terrain while moving.
Terrain tactics.
Depending on the map, this can be quite useful. This will all make sense later, but this is particularly good for chapters 12 and 16. Even Sigurd's engage attack helps you move further, allowing you to attack and move through a line of adjacent foes. A few things to remember about this ability. There needs to be an empty space on the other side of the enemies in order to use this. As long as there is one, there is no upper limit to the number of enemies you can move through. Theoretically, if there were 20 enemies all in a straight line, you could charge through and damage all of them with this skill. And finally, you get to canter after using this skill. For the class bonuses, dragons deal 20% more damage, armored and key adepts get a flat chance of breaking regardless of what weapon the enemy is using, 10% and 20% respectively, and mystical units don't base the entire attack off magic, but deal extra damage equal to 25% of their magic. This skill is useful for a few things. Firstly, it can let you kill weak enemies and damage stronger ones with the same action. Or for shish kebabbing multiple enemy cavalry with the Rider's Bane, Sigurd's first engage weapon. This is fairly heavy and its hit rate has issues sometimes, but it's effective against cavalry. And makes Override hilarious if you catch multiple of them in a line. Notably, there is a non-Sigurd Rider's Bane in Engage, and it's actually worse in every way. Though you need to be engaged with Sigurd to use his, so it's a trade-off. His Bond 10 engage weapon is the Brave Lance. A little weak and definitely shaky on the accuracy side, though Sigurd's skill inheritance can help with that. But it attacks twice when initiating combats. Remember that momentum will only apply to the first hit of the Brave Lance, but even with just that, it's enough to one-shot most enemies early on, and still be a respectable damage dealer even late into the game. If you've got a character and you're thinking, I could really use them halfway across the map right now, Sigurd is the emblem for you. For Sigurd's inheritance, all of his sync skills are inheritable, and 1000 SP is pretty cheap for canter. Yes, you can have this skill on your entire army if you have the SP for it, and as you'd expect, it's pretty useful. Momentum is also fairly cheap for what it does, but if I had 1000 SP with Sigurd, I'd rather inherit canter first. Meanwhile, Headlong Rush, as I've said before, is very cheap, and you want this on as many people as possible before Chapter 10. Sigurd's stat boosting skills raise accuracy, which is useful since his engaged weapons have a shaky hit rate. Though it's also good for anyone who has issues hitting. His weapon boost is the Lance Power line. Now these are very strong, straight up increasing your damage with lances, but they are fittingly very expensive. Without getting a lot of skill books, you are not affording these for a long time. And for proficiencies, Sigurd provides both lances and swords. Sigurd's maxed out stat boosts are Dex +4, Defense +4, and Build +3, along with the Move +1 he always had that sadly never goes up at higher levels. Being one of the few emblems to raise Build is a legitimately useful niche he has. At Bond level 13, he gets Canter Plus, same as the regular version, you just get to move 3 extra spaces. But every single space counts, and at Bond level 17, Momentum gets a bit of a strange upgrade. It works the exact same way it used to, except now it no longer caps out at a boost of +10. So if you move a crazily far distance, you can potentially do higher damage with this now. His Bond 15 weapon is Tearfing, which is reasonably strong, but doesn't have any effectiveness bonus or 1-2 range. It does give +5 resistance, which can make his user a mage killer, but it's no +10 skill, +10 speed, and +20 resistance. Yes, that's actually how it worked in the original genealogy. It also had 30 might, but skill inheritance, yeah. The higher versions of Hit Plus can be useful for characters with accuracy issues, especially on highly forged smash weapons. They're not that expensive compared to the other stat raisers. What is expensive is Lance Power. If you can afford this, all the more power to you, but it's not likely without using the whale a ton. But if you can spare 2000 SP, it's a pretty small price to pay for Canter Plus. Simple yet effective skill inheritance overall. Celica is the first magic-focused emblem we get, and she's one of the only ones, though she also raises strength slightly. Her first sync skill is Holy Stance, which reflects 10% of damage taken by corrupted foes during the enemy phase. 10% isn't much, and Celica has a much better way of dealing with corrupted. But at bond level 3, she gets something better, Resonance. This is a reference to spells costing HP in Fire Emblem Gaiden. It causes the user to lose 1 HP if they have 2 or more at the start of combat, to deal +2 damage with tomes. This extra damage can make a huge difference, though so can the 1 HP loss. While it's impossible for this to kill you, it can put you into kill range of other enemies, so be careful. At bond level 8, you get Favorite Food, which maxes out the engage meter when you eat a packed lunch. This is a type of consumable item made in the Somnial that we'll have access to later. This skill has a very weird niche use on one specific character, but apart from them, you can only have 1 packed lunch per chapter. Still, this potentially lets Celica's user get her engage twice back to back, and that can be really helpful when you look at Celica's engage abilities. Her first one is Echo. This one is pretty niche, but in the right circumstances, it can be very dangerous. It lets you essentially split your fire with a spell between 2 enemies, only dealing half damage each time. Dragons get +1 range with this, letting you attack with spells from 3 range or even more, while mystical units deal 10% more damage, which can make using Echo twice on the same enemy deal more damage than attacking normally. But Celica's main asset is her engage attack. This lets you warp up to 10 spaces away, ignoring terrain, and then attack with her engage weapon Ragnarok, which is incredibly powerful and in the early game usually one-shots most things. Yes, this is a common trend with the early emblems. Dragons get to attack from 3 range with this, cavalry warp up to 12 spaces, and flyers can warp up to 15. Mystical units just do more damage, but that's already a pretty big benefit. As for flying, you might think this would be great on a flying tome-using class. There's actually only a few of those classes, and they're all locked to specific characters, but those characters do make very good use of this. But Griffin Knight is a flying class that can't use tomes but still has a decent magic stat, so you might get some use out of that. Celica's first engage weapon is another of her biggest assets. Seraphim deals effective damage against Corrupted, which on certain chapters is every enemy on the map. That is pretty incredible. Her Bond 10 engage weapon is not a weapon, it's a staff. It's got a ton of power, which means it will often heal people to full HP, and it can be used even if Celica's wielder can't normally equip staves. I've also listed the stats of Ragnarok here, because some emblems have special engage weapons that will only be used during their engage attack. Ragnarok is not technically one of these, but for now the only way we can use it is Celica's engage attack, so here are its stats for reference. Clan and Saline have pretty much uncontested access to Celica for the next few chapters, but after that point, she's a good option for whoever your best mage is. Or just anybody you want to warp. All of Celica's sync skills are inheritable, and Favorite Food is quite cheap for its effects. And with how good engaging is, it's something you might want to spread around. Her stat boosts simply raise magic, but they are very expensive. Celica provides tome proficiency, which is very important. There are a number of characters with solid magic growths who don't start as mage classes. This can get them there. It's also good for promoting staff users to a class that doesn't rely on their bare hands for damage. She also gives sword proficiency, but it's a little cheaper to get this from Marth. But it does mean that Celica alone provides all the proficiencies someone needs for Mage Knight, and that's a great class. Celica's stat bonuses cap out at +3 strength, +5 magic, and +4 resistance. This is notably tied for the highest magic boost of any emblem, and the one it's tied with is DLC, making Celica great for offensive mages. But most notably of her higher bond levels are her upgrades to her sync skills. Holy Stance goes from a joke to much more significant, reflecting 30% of corrupted damage at bond level 12 and 50% at bond 18. Even better, from the point when Celica's paralog unlocks, almost every generic enemy in the main story is a corrupted, so this is going to be active almost all the time on the enemy phase. And she even gets a better version of Resonance at bond 16, dealing +3 damage with tomes for no additional cost in HP. Her bond 15 weapon is Ragnarok, the same one used for her engage attack, only this time it's usable during normal combat and can double. Its only downside, besides being a bit heavy, is having no secondary effect, which is rare for a bond 15 weapon. Celica's higher level inheritance is an odd mix of very underpriced and very overpriced. For how strong they are from this point on, the Holy Stance skills are very cheap. I don't recommend them on mages, but on someone bulky who sees a lot of enemy phase, this works wonders. Tome Precision is also pretty cheap. The same cannot be said of the Magic Plus skills. Resonance Plus is fairly easy to inherit if you use the well. Just bear in mind that HP reduction can put you into kill range of enemies, so always use with caution. Emblem Micaiah, proving that sometimes non-combat abilities are the strongest of all. Her ring boosts magic, resistance, and luck, though Celica provides a bigger boost to magic, so she's more recommended for offensive mages. Micaiah's first sync skill is Cleric, and unlike many, this is not inheritable, and you can probably see why, as it enables any class to be able to use staves up to rank C. Which may not sound like much, until you look at the list of staves and realize this includes Freeze, Silence, Obstruct, and Physic. Put this on a Lear and you can have them pull status staves out of the convoy to debilitate enemies, or you can use it to turn anybody you want into a healer if you need an extra one. At Bond 3 she gets Healing Light, which allows staff users to heal themselves a little when they heal others. Very useful on key adepts to keep them chain guarding. Last but certainly not least, at Bond 7 she gains Silence Ward, which grants immunity to silence. The silence status prevents you from using staves or tomes. It essentially locks magic users out of the battle for a few turns if it affects them, so it's recommended that you spread these to all of your main casters and healers. And if you thought her sync skills were good, just wait until you see Augment. While engaged with Micaiah, staves have +5 range and area of effect +1. What this means is staves that are normally single targets now affect a plus-shaped area, which lets you heal multiple injured allies with Heal and Mend, but its real use is freezing or silencing up to 5 enemies at once, pulling multiple enemies out of position with Entrap, or teleporting up to 4 allies with Warp or Rescue. Once you gain access to these staves, Micaiah becomes absolutely ridiculous. And combined with an emblem and character we get later, you can potentially warp half or more of your army in a single turn. The class bonuses for this skill aren't that interesting. Dragons just get an extra +1 staff range and key adepts heal more. But it doesn't matter when the base effect of the skill is so good. And then there's her engage attack, Great Sacrifice. Finally, Micaiah's sacrifice skill from Radiant Dawn is actually good. It fully heals your entire army and any NPC allies at the cost of reducing the user's HP to 1, which doesn't matter if they're out of range of enemies that turn. Dragons instead have their HP reduced to 30% of their current HP, Armor grant a temporary +1 defense to everyone healed, and for key adepts you also cure status. But Great Sacrifice has an added benefit on top of all this. It gives a massive amount of experience. Sticking Micaiah on a low-level character for a chapter or two is a great way to get them caught up. Micaiah's engage weapons are both tomes, and her default is Shine, which has a modest amount of might and a decent critical rate, but its unique factor is lighting up a 5-tile diamond around the target in Fog of War. The issue with this is, there are only 3 fog maps in the game, including this one, so it doesn't see a ton of use. At Bond 10, you get Nosferatu, which is a little heavy for a tome, but it restores the caster's HP equal to half the damage they deal. Micaiah's skill inheritance is interesting in that most of these skills are incredibly cheap to pass down. Her stat boosting skill raises resistance, her weapon boost skill makes staves heal more, but more importantly increases their accuracy. This doesn't matter for healing staves, as those always work. What it applies to is status staves, and that +10 or +15% to their hit rate is amazing. Her only inheritable sync skills are Healing Light and Silence Ward. Again, I recommend passing Silence Ward to all of your magic users. Healing Light is great on any staff user, especially key adepts like I mentioned before. For proficiencies, Micaiah provides 3. She's the first emblem to provide proficiency in staves, which is particularly nice for Alir, as it gives them access to key adept reclassing, which no one else can do until chapter 14. But she also provides proficiency in knives, a reference to both her love interest Soth and Radiant Dawn being the first game when knives were a separate weapon type, and tomes, as you would expect. Use Emblem Micaiah when you need more experience, need an extra staff user, or want to turn an existing staff user into a god. Micaiah's stat bonuses cap out at +6 luck, +5 resistance, and +4 magic. She's already very strong even before doing her paralogue, so what does this do for you? It's mostly Cleric Plus and Plus Plus, which let her user wield staves up to rank B and A respectively. At Bond 18, any character has access to every staff except the S rank one, and can utilize those with her amazing Augment skill. But note that neither of these skills can be inherited. Her Bond 15 weapon is the tactical horse and armor nuking incantation, Fanny. It has 11 might and is effective against cavalry and armored units, which is nice in theory, but once again, if you're using Micaiah for combat, you're using her wrong. Since Cleric can't be inherited, Micaiah's higher levels of skill inheritance are pretty barren, but they're still useful. She gives resistance +4 and 5, and the 3 highest versions of Staff Mastery. Hit +30 with status staves is incredible, making freeze and entrap nearly guaranteed when combined with Byleth's Divine Pulse, and they're very cheap in terms of SP, so I highly recommend these. Our boy Roy is finally here, and he's an incredibly straightforward emblem focused on offense and survivability. His ring gives a significant boost to HP, a big boost to strength, and a small boost to resistance. Roy only has 2 sync skills, but the first is so good he doesn't need a third. Hold Out makes it so that you always survive a combat with at least 1 HP if you had a certain HP threshold going into it. This even applies if the enemy attacks multiple times. If their first hit reduces you to 1 HP, the rest of their attacks will be forced to miss. This essentially makes it impossible for a single enemy to kill Roy's bearer. So if you're smart about where you position them and keep them healed, they can be outright invincible. Anything would pale in comparison to this, but Advance is still okay as a mobility tool. You'd be surprised how often melee attackers find themselves just barely out of range of enemies. When you're tired of defense and need to bring the offense, that's when you activate Roy's Engage and instantly gain 5 levels, channeling all the extra level ups Roy wishes he had in Binding Blade. This works even if you're at level 20, and dragons get an additional level, cavalry also get move +1, and armored units get +5 HP, on top of the sizable bonus Roy already gives. This skill can be described perfectly as boring but practical. It literally makes anyone better. His engage attack is Blazing Lion, what I like to consider the wide counterpart to Sigurd's Override. It doesn't deal any extra damage over a regular attack, but it hits a 3-space wide area in front of you, and afterwards sets both that area and the 2 rows beyond on fire. Anything, friend or foe, caught in the fire at the start of its turn loses 10% of its HP, but perhaps more importantly, it slows movement a lot, making it great for keeping dangerous foes at bay. Be aware that it will slow down you as well as the enemy, so I recommend waiting until near the end of your turn after you've moved most of your characters to use this engage attack. Dragons attack an additional 3-wide column with this, making it possible to deal damage to a clump of 6 enemies if you're lucky with their positioning, and mystical units still attack the same area, but set a longer area on fire afterwards. Roy's first engage weapon is the Lance Reaver. This, just like its home game, reverses the weapon triangle, so it will inflict break on lances, but will be broken by enemy axe users. At Bond 10, you get the Worm Slayer, which is effective against dragons, which in Engage is mainly just Wyvern Knights. The problem with dragon slaying weapons in Engage is they're not effective against corrupted worms. Fun fact though, both these weapons have the exact same stats they did in Roy's original game, which is not true for most Engage weapons. Roy's skill inheritance is the opposite of Micaiah in that almost all of them are insanely expensive, but for good reason, as they're also insanely powerful. Just don't expect to afford them without a lot of use of the Ancient Well. His stat boost raises strength, and every point of this helps, for physical attackers at least. But it's his weapon bonus that's even better. These straight up increase your attack power when equipped with swords. -10 avoid is a tiny price to pay for this. Both of Roy's sync skills can be inherited, and Advance is by far the most affordable. You can theoretically have a whole army running around with holdout focus sashes, just don't expect to have many other skills. Roy grants sword proficiency the earliest of any emblem we've seen so far. Overall, Roy is a very straightforward emblem. He makes any frontline physical attacker better at what they already do. Because of this, despite his power, he tends to be a bit of an afterthought, getting slapped onto whoever doesn't need a more specialized emblem. At Bond levels above 11, we finally have the annoyance that was Marnie on our side. Firstly, his boosts cap out at +10 HP, +6 strength, and +3 resistance. The strength boost is so big it can turn even mediocre attackers into decent ones. Or of course, make already good attackers even better. Speaking of even better, Holdout Plus has a threshold of 10% HP, but at Bond 18, Holdout Plus, yes it really goes that high, means that as long as you have more than 1 HP when an enemy initiates combat, you're guaranteed to live. This bears repeating. At bond level 18, Roy's user cannot be killed by a single enemy, excluding engage attacks. Position them well and give them healing items, and you have an immortal warrior. And this is only a sync skill. You don't even need to be engaged with Roy to have this. Oh, and they also have a fairly decent 1-2 range sword that gives +5 defense and resistance. The Binding Blade is simple, but it's one of my favorite Bond 15 engage weapons, especially since it gives backup attackers a 1-2 range chain attack option. At higher bond levels, Roy's inheritance continues the theme it always had. Extremely good, but stupidly expensive. If you wanted to inherit every skill from an emblem, Roy's would cost you the most SP, and it's not even close. But those lucky enough to be SP billionaires get the luxuries of +6 strength, +10 damage with swords, and literally refusing to die. On first impression, Leif is the worst emblem in the game. That is until you realise he's meant more for utility than combat, at which point he actually becomes really good. And that's fitting, because it also sums up Leif's performance in his home game perfectly. His emblem ring raises HP, though not to the extent of Roy, defense, but most importantly, build. And this is a big bonus to build too. I didn't mean to alliterate there. Combined with his inheritance, Leif is great for those characters who would love to double attack with heavy weapons, but whose build is lacking. While synced, Leif provides Arm Shield, which gives a reduction in damage if you have weapon advantage against the enemy, starting at -3 and upgrading to -5 at Bond 7. This gives the weapon triangle another purpose besides breaking. His other sync skill is one of his biggest assets, the ever-useful Vantage. At this level, it only triggers at 25% or less health. Once you're in range, you will always attack before the foe's counterattack on the enemy phase. This is often combined with high critical hit weapons, to bank on one-shotting the enemy before they hit you. This combines very well with another inheritable emblem skill obtained later on, as well as a character who joins the same time that later emblem does. But now we come to the negative, the reason why Leif is so disliked. His engage skill adaptable. On the enemy phase, so okay, synergizes with Vantage, Leif's user, if they have multiple weapons, and they will automatically switch to the best weapon to counter the foe. And I put best in air quotes because Leif's idea of best weapon is suboptimal at best and outright suicidal at worst. The skill prioritizes avoiding break. The problem is that it doesn't pay attention to the weight of the weapon it's equipping. And some of Leif's engage weapons, especially the Master Lance unlocked at Bond 10, are so heavy they can drop your speed 5 points below the enemies when it wasn't before and get you doubled. I've heard many horror stories of Adaptable literally getting people killed through equipping the Master Lance. And not just against sword users. If a ranged enemy attacks you and you have no other ranged weapon available, Leif will force the Master Lance on you. This skill at least gives an additional bonus to a variety of class types, and backups getting +10 crit works well with the Killer Axe, but it's still a pretty bad ability. Speaking of bad abilities, quadruple hits. This attacks the enemy once with each of Leif's 4 engage weapons. Now normally I don't show the engage weapons beyond rank 10 for the first emblem bio because they aren't unlocked yet. But I make an exception for Leif because people need to understand why quadruple hit is doing pathetic damage. Leif's engage weapons are not very strong, and the light brand is magical, so you need high strength and magic for optimal damage, which not many people have. And the Master Bow is only used during quadruple hit. These are its stats if you're interested, and they suck. it will break anything using a sword, axe, or lance, and if you're a key adept, it breaks anything, period. Dragons do more damage, and covert units have a luck percent chance to obtain 1,000 gold, which is a reference to Leif's blade from Fire Emblem Awakening, and maybe the capture mechanic from Leif's game. Like the rest of Leif's kit though, there are ways to make this good. The first one is sword power. For some reason, this affects all 4 hits, even though it should just affect the light brand one. All 4 hits are also boosted by Divinely Inspiring and Momentum if you have that. So, many consider not being engaged at all preferable to being engaged with Leif. The Killer Axe's crit boost is kind of nice, but it's inaccurate and heavy. The Master Lance is a 1 to 2 range brave weapon, but it's also very inaccurate, stupidly heavy, and weak, making it the main reason Adaptable sucks. But there's a way to get around it. If you raise someone's bond level with Leif to 9, and never do Leif's rank B bond conversation, you'll ensure they never unlock the Master Lance, thereby removing the hazard to a long and happy life. But if you don't want to use Leif for combat, and you probably shouldn't, you do want to raise his bond level as high as possible, because Leif's skill inheritance is where it's at, giving you fairly cheap boost to build, all the defensive arm shield with none of the baggage of using Leif, Vantage, arguably one of the most important inheritable skills in the game, Knife Precision to make your dagger users even better dodge tanks, and 6, count them, 6 weapon proficiencies. This is a reference to Leif's promotion to Master Knight in Fire Emblem Genealogy, which allowed him to use every weapon type, including tomes, which is the one proficiency he doesn't give here, but he does give knives which weren't in his game. Okay then. Simply having Leif's Emblem Ring opens up near infinite reclassing potential to your whole army. I'd argue that alone makes up for Leif's bad combats, but when he also passes down Vantage and build bonuses, Leif is a great utility emblem and not to be underestimated. Leif caps out most notably at build +5, but also defense +3 and HP +7. His higher bond levels simply give him better versions of his existing sync skills. Vantage Plus raises the threshold to 50% HP or less, and Vantage Plus boosts it to a pretty high by the standards of Vantage in Fire Emblem, 75% HP or less. And at bond level 16 you get Arm Shield Plus, which reduces damage by 7 instead of 5. For reasons, I had to cover the Bond 15 weapon, Light Brand, in Leif's previous bio because it's so important to quadruple hits, but in theory, it's a very good weapon. A 15 might, 20 crit, 1 to 2 range magic sword is pretty good. The problem is there aren't a lot of characters who really appreciate it and Leif's other engaged weapons, which are all physical. Leif's main inheritance claim to fame, his proficiencies, are all in his lower bond levels, so what do his higher ones offer? Well, it's really just Knife Precision and Vantage Plus and Plus. I consider this disappointing. Don't get me wrong, the stronger Vantages are incredible if you're doing a Wrath build, and they're fairly cheap for what they are. It's just, with the sheer hell you have to go through just to unlock Leif's higher bond levels, I wish more units could enjoy the benefits. Lucina is an emblem all about chain attack and chain guard, which bodes well since their mechanics I've gushed about. She boosts her holders' dex, speed, and luck. No offensive stats, but she doesn't need them. She's a support emblem. And she does that through her first sync skill, which can't be inherited, Jewel Strike. This allows any non-backup unit to act like a backup unit and chain attack. As a refresher, chain attacks have a fixed accuracy of 80% and deal damage equal to 10% of the enemy's max HP. And normally, they only trigger if the user is already in attack range of the enemy, which is usually 1 or 2 spaces away. But not with her other sync skill, Dual Assist. This lets units participate in chain attacks against enemies they could reach by moving. Now, it's only a 35% chance of triggering, but with how many engagements you take across the whole game, you'll be seeing this skill a lot, especially if you put it on a flyer or a cavalry unit. But my personal favourite application of this is on a knife user, because every time a knife chain attack hits, it inflicts a stack of poison. Put one in range of a boss and watch their health bars melt as the fight goes on. And this comes at the perfect time, since we're about to see a lot of bosses with 3 or more health bars. And would you believe me if I said that's far from the best thing about Lucina? No, the best thing is her engage skill, Bonded Shield. This was heavily slept on when the game first launched, until people realized it is one of the most broken things in Engage. When you use it, all adjacent allies have an 80% chance of having the first attack against them on the enemy phase blocked. Now you might be thinking, isn't that just a worse chain guard? Well, here's the thing, chain guard only works once per enemy phase. Bonded Shield does not have such limits. In the right circumstances, you can use this to rush a squad of 4 into the middle of enemy lines, immune to damage for the whole phase. That 20% fail rate is a pain, but there are ways to remedy that via the class bonuses. For dragons, it's only a 10% fail rate, but for cavalry, armored, and flying units, the trigger is guaranteed for units of the same type. This helps especially for cavalry or flyer-heavy armies, and a lot of people like to run with those. For cavalry especially, I'd recommend this on a wolf knight, so you can also contribute poison chain attacks. And if you're a key adept, 100% success rate at all times. With all those highs, there had to be a drawback, and that's Lucina's engage attack. It only does a normal attack on an adjacent foe, and then all allies within 2 spaces chain attack. Now, if you've got a lot of people stacked up, especially if you're using a backup unit for the range +1, this can do a lot of damage, although using Lucina on a backup unit is a waste of dual strike. Dragons at least get perfect accuracy with these chain attacks, but outside of very specific setups, this is my pick for weakest engage attack in the game. But you're not using Lucina for her engage attack anyway. For her engage weapons, she starts with the Noble Rapier, a little stronger than Marth's, but it doesn't give +20 avoid. Her second engage weapon is where it's at though. Parthia is amazing for a Bond 10 weapon. 17 might, which triples against flyers, and doubling your experience like Mercurius. The +5 res is just a bonus. Even though I said Lucina's more of a support emblem, Parthia does make her user a surprisingly great nuke against flyers when you need one. For inheritance, Lucina's stat boost is dexterity. In my opinion, it's not enough dexterity to make a huge difference, but at least it's cheap. Her weapon bonus is bow agility, which increases avoid rate when equipped with bows, including her Parthia. This is mainly useful because it stacks with another ability she gains later. She provides sword and bow proficiency, the first bow proficiency outside of Leif, but by far the most interesting thing here is dual assist. Even at a 35% activation rate, I would recommend spreading this around to your backup units. Remember though that you need to be a backup unit to use this without Lucina equipped, as dual strike is not inheritable. But if you've got 1000 SP to spare on someone, this will add up a lot of damage over the course of the game. Overall, Lucina is an incredible support emblem, enabling some great chain attack combos and insane enemy phase power with Bonded Shield. Lucina eventually reaches Dex +5, Speed +4, and Luck +6. At Bond 13, she gains another sync skill, Dual Support, which gives her holder +5 avoid for every support level from adjacent allies, up to a maximum of +90 avoid, and each support counts for a certain number of levels, as shown here. This is particularly good on Alir, who not only supports everyone, but is the only person who can have S supports. At Bond 18, Dual Assist upgrades to Dual Assist Plus, having a double success rate of 70%. This means that, most of the time, enemies within movement range of Lucina's holder, and remember she can be on a cavalry unit or a flyer, essentially have 10% less HP, and that really adds up with how many combats you'll be taking in this game. At Bond 15, Lucina unlocks her final engage weapon, Parallel Falchion, which is effective against dragons, and that has problems that I'll get into later, but is kind of weak for a Bond 15 weapon. I don't find myself using this too often. At levels above 10, both Dual Support and Dual Assist Plus are inheritable. Just remember, there's no reason to inherit Dual Assist or its Plus version on anybody who is not already capable of chain attacks. If you're using Pandreo, Dual Support is kind of hilarious on him. Other than that, Bow Agility eventually gives +30 avoid when using a bow, though it's expensive to get it this high, and she eventually grants Dexterity +5. Dual Support and Dual Assist Plus are, I feel, the main reasons to do Lucina's Paralogue, but it's available very early and isn't too difficult, so these skills aren't that far out of reach. Lyn is one of the strongest combat emblems in the game. Her ring boosts dexterity, speed, and resistance. Speed is the big one, as it can let you hit doubling thresholds you might not otherwise. Speaking of doubling thresholds, that's what Lyn's all about. That and archery. Her first sync skill is Alacrity. If you initiate combat, so this is player phase only, with 9 speed or higher than the enemy, then, as long as you're not wielding a weapon that can't double, your second attack will always occur before the foe can counterattack. A 9 speed advantage is easier to hit than you'd think, especially with Lyn's other abilities, and this skill allows you to take out a dangerous foe without being damaged by them. At Bond level 3, she gets Speed Taker. Every time a unit with this skill kills an enemy, they gain +2 to their speed that lasts for the rest of the chapter. It goes up to a bonus of +10, but this makes Lyn's user snowball hard. With a few of these under your belt, you'll be getting Alacrity on almost everything, thereby making it even easier to secure kills and boost Speed Taker even more. And the fun doesn't stop there. Let's talk about Lyn's engage skill called Doubles. Now, the only bad thing about this is it consumes an action to do this. You can't attack in the same turn, and Lyn's users really like attacking. But it might be worth it. This skill creates 4 illusory doubles adjacent to the user. These doubles can't move, only have Manichates, and have 1 HP, but otherwise are identical to the user, up to and including unit type. They can't attack, but can counterattack. And if Lyn's user attacks an enemy, all doubles automatically chain attack, regardless of how far away the enemy is. But they will never chain attack for anyone else. Dragons create 5 doubles, and Flyers doubles have Avoid +10. So why is this skill so good? 2 words: AI manipulation. If you've played Sacred Stones and used the Summoner class, you might be familiar with this, but if you haven't, the AI in Fire Emblem loves to kill things, and it sees a 1 HP illusion as something it's guaranteed to kill, and therefore its highest priority target, and this can literally save lives. Just absorbing an attack is great, but if you have the right unit, hint hint a covert putting them in terrain, these doubles can actually dodge tank and possibly even crit and kill something. The one downside of this skill is enemies killed by doubles don't give experience. So Lynn's sync skills are amazing, her engage skill is amazing, and oh look, her engage attack is also amazing! Astra Storm launches 5 bow attacks at 30% damage up to a range of 10. These can't crit, but each hit can trigger activation skills like Luna or Ignis. Key Adepts automatically break the target, but much more useful is Dragons shooting up to 15 spaces and Coverts shooting up to 20. This attack has several uses. The first is as an emergency delete one flyer button. The second is to apply debuffing skills from far away, but that comes into play with a later emblem. The third, and my personal favourite, is aggroing bosses from halfway across the map. Most bosses in Engage will charge at you the moment they first get attacked, and this lets you cheese a lot of later chapters and especially paralogs. If you're playing on Maddening, many of the paralogs become vastly easier if you Astra Storm aggro the boss on turn 1. Astra Storm with a Radiant Bow is a surprisingly good boss killer too. Lynn's one failing point for now is her engage weapons. The killer bow is nice, but it needs to crit to do good damage, and since this version can't be forged or engraved, I prefer a regular killer bow. And then there's the Manikadi. Sure, it's effective against armored units and cavalry, and it has an okay crit rate, but with a might of 6, I don't find it that useful. As for skill inheritance, Lynn's stat boost skills are speed, and they're a steal for what they give you. Sometimes just one extra point of speed is enough to meet a doubling threshold. Bow focus though, I'm not a big fan of. Most bows don't have trouble hitting anyway, and raising the odds of enemy crits is just asking for trouble. But what you're really here for are Alacrity and Speed Taker. Honestly, 2000 SP is not a lot considering how good Speed Taker is. Many units who join at this point start with at least 1000 SP, letting them grab this with just one expert book. A quick word of warning though. Speed Taker, for complicated reasons, gets worse the more people in your army have it. Basically, they compete with each other for kills, and every person who has it means an extra 5 enemies that need to die to get maximum benefit. It can be good to inherit, but I recommend only giving it to one other person besides Lynn's main user. And even the lowest version of Alacrity is still pretty good. So in summary, Lynn fans can finally rejoice. She is incredible in Engage, both support-wise and offensively. Lynn's stat boosts cap out at Dex +4, Resistance +3, and an incredibly significant Speed +5. Even to the end, Lynn only has 2 sync skills. All she gets from bond levels above 10 is upgrades to Alacrity, but that's all you really need. Alacrity Plus at 13 changes the threshold to 7 speed over the foe, and Alacrity Plus Plus at bond 18 makes the threshold 5 speed over the foe, which essentially means if you're doubling, you're getting Alacrity. And this is particularly nice when combined with Lynn's bond 15 engage weapon, Mulagir, a weapon that wasn't even in Lynn's game, but thanks to Heroes, it's hers now. This is one of my favourite engage weapons, a massively powerful bow that isn't all that heavy, and gives +5 speed on top of all the other speed Lynn gives you. Even low strength characters become monsters with this. Oh, and it also has dragon effectiveness for what that's worth. Lynn's higher level inheritance is pretty simple. It's just better versions of bow focus that I still don't like much, better versions of Speed Plus, which I do like much, especially Speed +4, 1000 SP is not a lot to ask for that. As well as Alacrity Plus and Alacrity Plus, which are admittedly appreciated by faster, frail characters, but they're very expensive. He's not Little Lord Ike anymore, he's Big Lord Ike. Taking more after his Smash Bros version, Ike turns his holder into a tank. And boosting HP, strength, and defense isn't even the half of it. Ike weirdly has 2 Bond level 1 sync skills, though the first is very situational. Demolish lets Ike's holder instantly destroy destructible terrain by selecting the, well, destroy command. This can be done from any range you have a weapon covering, and mainly sees use in Chapter 13 itself. But he also gets Resolve. This is nowhere near as crazy as it was back in Path of Radiance, but it's still kinda nice. Whenever you're below 75% HP, you get +5 to defense and resistance, on top of the bonus Ike already gives you. This is really nice when it comes to his engage skill, but first, at Bond level 3, Ike gains Reposition, letting him move adjacent allies to the opposite side of himself. This effectively pushes an ally 2 spaces forward, making it a nice mobility tool. But Ike is one of the few emblems who I'd argue radically changes his holder's playstyle while engaged. Because then, Legu's friend takes effect. Its name references Ike protecting Ranulf in Chapter 11 of Path of Radiance. It causes all attacks to deal half damage, at the cost of setting the user's avoid to 0. This doesn't mean enemies always hit, but if they have a hit rate of 100 or more, they will. In practice, only Mage Cannoneers are likely to miss you in this state, effectively doubling the number of enemies Ike's user can take on at once. At the cost of being forced to stand there and take it, don't use him on someone who likes dodge tanking. Dragons take 60% less damage instead. The halving damage combined with Resolve's +5 resistance makes Ike users surprisingly bulky even against mages. And Ike later gains a 1 to 2 range engage weapon to really capitalize on that. You do need to be aware of chain attacks though. Their damage is percentage based, so it's unaffected by this reduction. The general idea after engaging with Ike is to run in the middle of a horde of enemies and use his engage skill, Great Ether. You need to use a sword or axe for this, but that means it's usable via great axes for an insane attack power. It gives defense and res +5, which stacks with Resolve and Ike's defense bonus, but you can't counterattack for 1 turn. Next turn though, you'll attack everything in a 2-space area and heal HP equal to 30% of the damage dealt to each enemy. Dragons deal an extra damage per hit taken while charging this up. Armored units and flyers gain an increase to defense or resistance. Think of this skill as turning Ike's user into a bomb that goes off next turn. You want to lure in as many enemies as possible so they all get hit by it. It's better to initiate this with a high might weapon rather than a high speed one, since every target will only get hit once, just as long as you're not getting doubled to death. Speaking of high might, high weight weapons, those are Ike's engage weapons right now. At Bond level 1, you gain access to the legendary hammer that Ike canonically used to defeat the Black Knight. I love that they reference this. So this is different to a typical hammer in that it's a smash weapon. But to compensate, it's literally twice as strong as an unforged regular hammer. At Bond 10, you get Irvan. 19 weight is crazy, but it's got a high hit rate for an axe and a massive 21 power, and gives plus res on top of Ike's existing bonuses to the stat. Ike's skill inheritance is focused on axes, and that's the weapon proficiency he gives, though he still gives swords at rank 9. His stat boost is an increase to defense, which can be nice on people you want to tank with. His weapon bonus is axe power, and this really stacks up with his engage attack. Though like with Roy, this is expensive to inherit. You can also inherit his sync skills, and Resolve is the main prize here. Here's the thing with Ike though. His true potential won't be unleashed until you complete his paralogue. There's one more sync skill he has, and it is a key to his kit. Fortunately, that paralogue unlocks right after this chapter, and it's one I'd recommend doing as soon as possible. Ike's stat bonuses cap out at +7 HP, +4 strength, and +5 defense. And at Bond 18, Resolve upgrades to Resolve Plus, giving +7 to defense and resistance when below 75% HP. But the most infamous part of Ike's kit is his Bond level 13 sync skill, Wrath. For some reason they gave Ike 4 sync skills. Wrath gives +1 to critical rate during combat for every HP Ike's bearer has lost, up to a maximum of +30. As you can tell, this stacks quite well with Resolve and also works very well in combination with Vantage if you had the foresight to inherit that from Leif earlier. Combine with Lynn's engrave on a weapon, and you can easily reach crit rates of at least 70%, letting Ike's user tank a hit and then annihilate the enemy in response. Though as most high crit weapons are one range only, this doesn't work as well against ranged opponents, but for that, Ike has an answer: Ragnall at Bond level 15. This is a very strong sword that is 1 to 2 range and physical, a rarity for this weapon type, and also gives defense +5. Ike's higher level inheritance mostly consists of stronger versions of axe power, still great but still really expensive, defense +4 and +5, and his sync skills. Now, several characters might want to inherit Wrath. I personally feel 2000 SP is a lot to ask for this. Perhaps because you also need to inherit Vantage to get the most out of this. Sometimes just having Wrath on Ike's user is enough. Byleth is simultaneously the most simple and the most complex emblem in the game, offering incredible support all the time and decent offense with certain users. Despite seeming like a physical attacker, he actually boosts magic, along with speed and luck. His luck boost is significant, and that's actually not a bad thing because of his first sync skill, Divine Pulse. This gives a 30% +1 for every points of luck chance to turn a missed attack into a hit. Now, already this sounds great for people who have accuracy problems, but what the game doesn't tell you is, this also affects status starves like Freeze and Silence. Byleth's level 3 sync skill is simple but incredible. It grants a 1.2 times experience multiplier to both the holder and everybody adjacent. And Byleth likes standing near people because of their engage abilities. Their engage skill lets them, on command, give a buff to all allies within 2 spaces. The buff depending on unit type, so Byleth has a lot of versatility here. Dragon giving all stats +3 makes Aaliyah a very popular choice for Byleth, but Covert speed +5 is also nice. That essentially means you double everything with speed less than or equal to yours. Strength +4 from backup and defense +5 from armored are also nice. The minor issue I have with this skill is it's only usable while engaged, and it requires you to spend your turn, pushing Byleth's user towards a support role. But the engage attack is very much worth using your turn for, no matter who you are. This refreshes the movement of every adjacent ally. That means up to 4 people can move and act twice in the same turn. This lets you accomplish so many things you otherwise couldn't. Beating multi-health par bosses in a single turn, rushing to villages, killing up to 8 enemies with a squad of 4, and it gets better. We haven't even got our dancer yet, and unlike many refresh effects, Goddess Dance can refresh dancers who have already refreshed another ally. Which means that with good positioning, you can get up to 6 people to act twice in a turn. And as a bonus, everyone refreshed by Goddess Dance, though only those adjacent, not within 2 spaces, get the same buff that Instruct would give. Goddess Dance alone makes Byleth one of the best emblems in the game, if not the best. And I haven't even got over his engage weapons yet, because when Byleth was asked which hero's relic he wanted to bring to engage, he answered yes. Every class type gets a different engage weapon or sometimes item from Byleth. And in a painful display of irony, dragons get Eimer. A smash weapon with 20 crit is nice, but I don't see this used much because dragons lean more towards support with Byleth. Speaking of things I don't see used much, backup units get Blutgang, which would be okay if it wasn't a magic sword and worse than the Leffen sword and lacking 1 to 2 range. Cavalry effectiveness is sort of nice, but in practice there aren't a lot of backup units with the magic to use this. Cavalry get Aradbar, which boosts might by 50% when initiating combat. Easy to do when you've got high movement. Covert units get a really nice one, Failnort, a 2 to 3 range bow with a decent crit rate and granting plus 20 avoid when initiating combat. Great if you're already attacking from that double terrain avoid. Flyers get Lewin, which we've seen enemy Hortensia use effectively. Armors get the Aegis Shield, which boosts defense by a lot and resistance by a little, and gives a dex % chance to halve damage. I find this one of the least useful Byleth items. Because mystical units get Lysithia's Staff of Ultimate Doom. The fun thing about plus 2 range for magic is it also affects Surge, giving you a very powerful attack with none of its usual drawbacks. But regular 2 range tomes are now 4 range, and Thunder is now 5, though you can't stack this with Dire Thunder. This is my personal favourite way to use Byleth. It turns a strong magic user like Pandreo into a long-range assassin who's never at risk of counters. And in the rare times they do, there's a chance they take half damage. Key Adepts get the very strange Raphael Gem. Strange because it negates effectiveness damage, but the only time that comes into play is a Lear reclassed into a Key Adept. Preventing critical hits is kinda nice, but overall not my favourite use of Byleth. At Bond 10, every class type gets the Vajra Mushti, an arts weapon that strikes on the lower of the foe's defense and resistance, which is how I wish all arts worked. Weird and hilarious fact about this weapon. When used by Temera, in a very specific circumstance, it's one of the few ways Sandstorm can do less damage than attacking normally. Oh, and Byleth also has skill inheritance, I guess. His stat boosts raise luck, which is actually quite good because of Divine Pulse. Or once you inherit Celica's favourite food on Bunay, you can give these to him for a silly goddess dance spam build. His weapon boost is Art Focus, which I find the worst one in the game. Why would you make yourself more prone to crits for more accuracy with Art? Well, I guess with the Raphael Gem you have that downside negated. I literally just realized that while recording this. But what you're really here for are Divine Pulse and Mentorship, which are insanely cheap for what they do. And the other thing you're here for is that, finally, we have a non-DLC emblem who can teach art proficiency. Finally, you can reclass people to Key Adept who are not Alir, Fram, and Jean. In summary, Byleth has possibly the best engage attack in the game, some situationally useful but pretty good engage weapons, and cheap and effective inheritance. It's as if being able to speak has unleashed his true power. Byleth's overall boost of plus 3 magic isn't that high for a max bond level, but it comes with plus 3 speed and a very big luck bonus, and every point of luck counts with Byleth. Though not because of their Bond 13 skill. Lost and Found gives you a luck % chance to raise support points with an adjacent ally after acting or waiting next to them. It's only 1 support point, the same as using a staff or fighting while adjacent, and it's subject to the rounding issue that all support points gained during battle in Engage have. Meaning it's overall more of a joke skill than anything useful, just a silly reference to the lost items in 3 houses. Definitely not a joke though is the Bond 18 skill Divine Pulse Plus, which has a 50% chance of turning a miss into a hit, which increases by 1 for every 1 point of luck. If I'm doing my maths right, this essentially means your accuracy gets exponentially better the lower it is. For example, a 1% hit rate effectively becomes around 51% with Divine Pulse Plus, and that's with 0 luck. And remember, once again, that it works on status staves too. Byleth's Bond 15 weapon is the Sword of the Creator. It's a little weak by Bond 15 standards, but it does come with 1 to 2 range, and +1 damage for every 3 magic the user has. Though it is still a strength-based weapon, so don't expect dedicated mages to do a lot with it. The main draws of Byleth's higher level inheritance are the Luck Plus skills, which get pretty significant, as well as Divine Pulse Plus. I can't be the only one who thinks this skill is severely underpriced for how good it is. Though to be fair, it is the main noteworthy thing about completing Byleth's Paralog, as Byleth is a rare emblem who's very good regardless of Bond level. Corrin is a strange and often misunderstood emblem, but a very good one when used right. Sadly, their join chapter isn't the best showcase of them. Their stats boost HP, magic, and resistance, and the HP boost is pretty high, making them a surprisingly good emblem for tanking. But it's their first sync skill that really stands out. They have other sync skills, but like Byleth, I'm giving this one its own page. Dragon Vein doesn't even require you to be engaged with Corrin, and at the cost of your turn, it allows you to essentially create terrain. Before I go over each one, an important thing to note is this terrain affects both sides equally. The beneficial effects can also benefit enemies, and the harmful effects can also harm you, so be careful where you place it. Backup units create stone pillars that raise defense and avoid, good if you're choke pointing. Cavalry units create the same kind of water tiles that appeared in Chapter 11, though in a checkerboard pattern that requires some thought to use to its fullest. Speaking of which, coverts have probably the most no-brainer of Corrin's abilities, and the reason why they were misunderstood for so long. It creates a 3x3 square of fog that raises the avoid of everyone inside it, and covert units obviously get this bonus doubled. In the early days of Engage, this saw a lot of use on Yunaka, but the hype for this build has died down a lot as the game aged. Mostly because if you rely on it alone, you don't get any of Corrin's other veins, and they can also be good. Armored units create vines that grant break immunity, letting non-armors enjoy some enemy phase offense. Flyers create a healing glow that restores HP. Mystical units create flames that not only cause damage, they also heavily slow the enemy's movement. This is very similar to Roy's Engage attack, except it's usable every single turn. Alongside Corrin's boost to magic, this makes Mystical some of the better users of her. Finally, Key Adepts creates ice pillars that are exactly the same as the Obstruct Staff, just in an area. But the biggest thing here to note is that dragons get access to every single one of these at all times. This makes Corrin a pretty good emblem for Alear if you keep them in Divine Dragon, giving them an incredibly versatile support role. And that's before going into Corrin's other sync skills. At Bond 3, she gets quality time. Is that what the kids are calling it these days? Whatever you call it, it restores 5 HP to all adjacent allies after you act and slightly increases support level with them. More of a silly reference than anything, but 5 HP can sometimes be helpful. The really helpful thing though is Draconic Hex at Bond rank 8. If Corrin's user initiates combat, it debuffs the target's stats by 4, which is very significant, especially against bosses. The penalties recover by 1 each turn, but the enemy will usually be dead before they wear off. Draconic Hex also combos well with Corrin's Engage skill, Dreadful Aura. This freezes the target and all adjacent foes when Corrin's user initiates combat. Covert units also debuff the target's avoid by 20. All of this gives Corrin the interesting and somewhat unique role of shutting down dangerous foes with debuffs, and it's always a good idea to use them first against bosses. Her Engage attack is Torrential Roar, yet another final smash that's become canon. It attacks 3 spaces in a line with the Dragon Fang engage weapon, and turns those tiles into water terrain afterwards. Dragons get range +1. Now, this typically doesn't kill a lot of things, but remember that every enemy in the area and everything adjacent to those enemies will get frozen by Dreadful Aura, and everything in the area gets hit by Draconic Hex, contributing even further to Corrin's role as a debilitator and boss killer. But if Corrin has a weakness, it's her engage weapons, which I think are among the worst in the game. The dual katana has the same effect as Roy's Lance Reaver, but it's pretty weak. While the wakizashi is nice in theory, but it is locked to 2 range specifically, and debuffs your avoid by 10. It's also pretty weak. I've also listed the stats of Dragon Fang here, as this is what Corrin's engage attack is calculated from. As far as weaknesses go, Corrin's skill inheritance is also a little barren. The only weapon proficiency she grants is swords, and you already have plenty of those by now. Sword focus is also meh. I just realized the only weapons they gave focus skills to are art, bows, and swords, i.e. the weapon types that don't need help with accuracy. Okay then. But the HP plus skills are pretty nice for how cheap they are. And, although expensive, Draconic Hex is a very significant inheritable skill. Let's just say, you can give this to somebody with Lyn, and apply it from 10 to 20 spaces away with Astra Storm. And most characters who join from here on, start with enough SP to pick it up either right away, or very soon. Overall, Corrin excels at survivability and slowing down the enemy, either via terrain or with stat debuffs. At Bond 15, Corrin gets a new sync skill, Pair Up, which completely nullifies all damage from opposing chain attacks. Combined with Corrin's massive plus 15 HP at max level, this makes her surprisingly decent on tanks. She also ends up boosting magic by 4 and resistance by 3. The HP is the main point of significance. Speaking of HP, at Bond 18, Corrin's user becomes a Master Face Toucher, restoring 10 HP instead of 5. Corrin's Bond 15 weapon is the Yato, which somehow manages to still be disappointing despite decent stats on paper. For a Bond 15 weapon, 16 Might just doesn't cut it when it has no 1 to 2 range, no major stat boost, and no effectiveness bonus. The Avoid plus 10 is outclassed by Marth's Rapier, the first engage weapon you ever got. But as always, you're not using Corrin for her engage weapons. For higher level inheritance, you get better sword focus, which is admittedly fairly cheap for a weapon skill, HP plus 12 and plus 15, which are fun to stack on top of Corrin's HP boost, and inheritable quality time plus, and Pair Up. Pair Up is the main one, though it has a lot of competition for 2000 SP skills. Still, this is nice to inherit on your main Ike user, or on a tank you don't want to give Corrin to. Eirika is similar to Roy, in that her focus is making people better at what they already do. But she's a little more complicated than he was. Firstly, she boosts magic, dexterity, and luck. As is typical of luck bonuses, it gets buffed a lot compared to other stats. Her boost to magic isn't as big as dedicated mage emblems, but it helps with one of her engage weapons, and makes her somewhat useful on magic attackers, but I say somewhat because of her first sync skill, Lunar Brace. This only works when initiating combat with physical attacks, and causes you to deal extra damage equal to 20% of the target's defense stats, like a mini Luna. Obviously, the higher the enemy's defense, the more damage you'll do with this. But from this point on, especially on higher difficulties, most enemies have enough defense that the extra damage is very significant. And at Bond level 3, she gets Gentility, which causes her user to take 3 less damage. Simple so far, but the twist is Eirika is 2 emblems in one. By selecting Night and Day, which does use up your action, you'll switch over to Ephraim. Yes, he's here too, he's just not very talkative. Ephraim swaps Lunar Brace for Solar Brace, which has you recover HP equal to 30% of damage dealt when initiating combat, and swaps Gentility for Bravery, which causes you to deal 3 more damage, even if you wouldn't otherwise do damage. It's easy to forget Ephraim because you have to spend a turn switching to him, but against weaker defense enemies, like magic users, or if you are a magic user and wouldn't benefit from Lunar Brace, Ephraim could be the more useful emblem. Since both Eirika and Ephraim add true damage onto any attack, you want to use them on somebody who is at least doubling, or even better, quadruple attacking with a brave weapon. This damage really stacks up when hitting multiple times. But why not both? When engaged with Eirika, instead of any unique ability, you simply get the effects of both Eirika and Ephraim's skills at the same time. You'll deal +3 damage on top of Lunar Brace, while also healing and taking 3 less damage. Which might not seem like much, but trust me, you become quite the powerhouse in this form, especially due to Twin Strike. Honestly, my pick for one of the best engage attacks in the game. Why? Because it does insane damage to Corrupted, and let's just say they're going to get more common. Use this against an adjacent foe to make a sword attack, either with one of Eirika's or your own, followed by an attack from Ephraim's Sigmund, which is effective against Corrupted and very powerful. Dragons do 20% more damage, while for Cavalry, Ephraim deals 50% more damage, which is usually overkill. This gets a lot better once you have Eirika's Bond 15 weapon, but for now, Eirika's first Bond weapon is the Rapier. It actually has the same might and hit as Marth's, but it lacks the +20 evasion and is a little heavier, but it has 10 crit to kind of make up for that. At Bond 10, you get the Wind Sword. Magic weapons have been pretty good in Engage so far, so this is a good sign. And it's no Radiant Bow, but flyer effectiveness helps against Wyverns. I've also listed the stats of Sigmund here. They're only used during Twin Strike. For Eirika's Inheritance, she gives Dodge or Critical Avoid boosting skills. They're pretty expensive, but might be worth it if there's someone you really don't want getting crits. Lance Agility increases Avoid at the cost of critical rate when using a lance. And speaking of lances, through Eirika we finally have access to lance proficiency again. She also gives swords, but that's hardly new. Her inheritable sync skills are very unique though. Inheriting Lunar Brace and Gentility gives you both versions of the skill. They'll automatically swap whenever Eirika's user uses Night and Day. That's what it means by all allies in that skill's description. They're so expensive that I don't often see them get inherited. But if you do, be careful when you use Night and Day, as some people prefer one version of this skill over the other. On that note though, these skills also turn into Clear Skies and Eclipse Brace whenever Eirika's user engages. So whoever inherits these is at the mercy of Eirika's user. Overall, in spite of Eirika and Ephraim's complexities, they really just make you do more damage and take less damage. But you need to be reasonably strong already to make the best use of them. So I'm more about making someone already strong even better than making someone weak usable. Eirika's final stat bonuses are Magic +3, Dex +4, and Luck +10. That's good, but unlike Byleth, she doesn't do much with this extra luck. I suppose it makes you less likely to be crits. Eirika's other boosts at bond levels beyond 10 are simple yet extremely effective. Lunar Brace and Gentility get upgraded to their plus versions, dealing damage equal to 30% of the enemy's defense, and reducing damage by 5 respectively. And of course, Ephraim isn't left out. He upgrades to healing 50% of damage dealt, and dealing +5 damage. Eclipse Brace and Clear Skies, while engaged, are also upgraded to plus versions. making Eirika a rare example of an emblem whose engage skill technically gets better as her bond level increases. But speaking of getting better, at Bond 15, Eirika gets access to her Sacred Twin weapon, which has similar stats to Ephraim's, but is also effective against Corrupted. And this is huge, because from this point on, you fight Corrupted almost exclusively in the main story, which effectively makes this weapon triple might against every generic enemy. Use this for her engage attack, and you are nearly guaranteed to delete any regular enemy, including corrupted worms. If there's just one troublesome foe that has to die this turn, send Eirika at them. Her higher levels of skill inheritance are just better versions of what she already gave. Due to their price, it takes a lot of planning to inherit the Bracelet Plus skills and Gentility or Bravery onto somebody. But if you do, they become insanely strong. Lance Agility is nice to make spear dodge tanks, some flyers appreciate that, and Dodge Plus can be okay for avoiding criticals, I guess. Alear has finally awakened to their true calling as the 13th Emblem. But as they're both an emblem and a controllable ally, they work uniquely. To use Alear's Engage, move them next to another ally and select Engage Plus. This puts both themselves and that ally into Alear's Engage state, at the cost of just Alear's Engage meter. Alear's bond level is not raised by fighting or bond fragments, but is instead dependent on their support rank with their engage partner. None is bond level 1, C is bond 5, B is 10, A is 20, and S will cover later. Alear has no skill inheritance, but anyone at bonds 10 or a B support with them gains sword and arts proficiency. Finally, there's no way to simply sync with Alear. You are either engaged with them or not. And being engaged will give you every bonus you see here. So let's finally go over those. Alear's stat bonuses are to HP, speed, and defense, all making themselves and their engaged partner more durable, while the plus 4 speed can help with doubling thresholds. At bond level 1, you gain Holy Aura. Finally an answer to Corrupted Worms, it only took us 22 chapters. Though the main use of this skill is against the final boss. At bond 5, you gain Bond Forger, which gives hit and avoid plus 20 to themselves, and all allies within 2 spaces who have an emblem ring, which this late in the game should be most of your army. This upgrades to Bond Forger Plus at Bond 20, which gives plus 30 hit and avoid, and also at Bond 20 is Holy Shield, which neutralizes all effectiveness bonuses against the unit. For Alear, this means they don't have to fear dragon-slaying weapons. For others, well, flyers not needing to fear bows is amazing. Alear's engage skill, though technically everything they have is an engage skill, is attuned. Whenever the user initiates combat and defeats an enemy, the other member of the Alear Engage pair gets plus 4 to all their basic stats, and they'll gain additional stats based on the attacker's unit type. The idea behind this is that Alear and their partner gradually snowball each other as they make their way across the battlefield. To get the most use out of this, you'll need both Alear and the partner to be decent combat units, and that's not always the case. Alear's engage attack, Dragon Blast, is fairly simple. You can only initiate it with a sword, either one of your own or one of Alear's engage weapons, against an adjacent enemy, and you'll deliver one attack with the sword, and then a magic beam attack with 20 might. Dragons deal plus 20% damage, backup units add 20% of their strength stat to the sword attack, while mysticals add 20% of their magic to the beam attacks. Key adepts inflict automatic break. And if used while the other member of the Alear Engage pair is adjacent to you, it becomes Bond Blast, and that ally delivers an additional sword attack with Alear's first engage weapon. Overall, this attack suffers from the same problem Leif's quadruple hit does. You kind of need to have good strength and magic to do the maximum damage with it, which not a lot of characters have. But with the Fell Dragon effectiveness granted by your level 1 bond skill, this can do a lot of damage to the final boss. Alea's first engage weapon is Liration, thought to be derived from lilac and relation. Lilac being both a mixture of red and blue, and representing friendship and remembrance in the Japanese language of flowers. It has stats on par with your average Bond 15 weapon, and it also fills adjacent allies' engage meters when you defeat an enemy on the player phase. Used well, you can pull some crazy combos with this, such as replenishing a Byleth user. At Bond 10, you get an art weapon, Dragon's Fist. It has the brave effect that most arts do, but it's an entirely magic weapon. At Bond 20, you get Oligoludia, which seems to be derived from the Greek for the noble few. It's effective against Corrupted, but its might is very low, so it's no Eirika. Alea can grant a sizable boost to both themselves and one other ally when using their engage mode. But remember, they can still spend their engage meter on their own emblem, so you'll need to decide which engage form is the best for the situation. But now that we have this form, Sombron should be afraid, because it was made to destroy him. Using Engage Plus with an S-supported character gives both them and Alea the boon of Elios sync skill. This gives a boost to critical and critical avoid equal to 2 times the number of allies who have acted this turn. This means you get the biggest benefit from this skill by attacking last in the turn, and doing this on a map with 14 deployment slots, like the final chapter, will give plus 26 critical. I've tested whether Dance and Goddess Dance affect this, and no, they don't. Anyone refreshed with a dance counts as not having acted, so they'll need to finish their second action in order to count for this skill. Overall, an extra 1 in 4 chance to crit is nice, but it's not reliable unless you're already running a crit build, and in that case your crit rate's already so high you likely don't need more anyway. Also note that this skill has no effect on Dragon Blast / Bond Blast, as that attack cannot critical. Probably the best use of Boon of Elios is on a magic user with the Dragon's Fist engage weapon. If you're doubling the enemy, that's 4 chances at a crit with high magic damage. But overall, I don't find this impactful enough to have full debates on an optimal S support, so just give it to whoever you like best. Alea also grants the following bonus if they're adjacent to their S support partner. It's time for things to get complicated, and I don't just mean the discourse. The Emblem of Rivals is like Eirika and Ephraim, except instead of 2 emblems in one, it's 3. And unlike those two, you don't get to control who's in the lead, thanks to their initial sync skill, friendly, in the biggest air quotes ever, rivalry. At the start of every player phase, the emblem will randomly switch between Edelgard, Dimitri, and Claude, and there's 2 things you need to know about this skill. Firstly, it is possible to get the same Lord 2 turns in a row. Secondly, the skill stops working while you're engaged. At that point, you're locked into the Lord you're currently on. Though in practice, which Lord you're on only affects the Gambit skill and one other skill they'll get later, as while engaged, you'll have access to all their engaged skills and all their engaged weapons. But this Gambit skill, it's a command ability that you'll always have while synced with the Emblem of Rivals. When Edelgard is active, it becomes Flame Gambit, which creates flame terrain in a 3x3 area around the target after use. Unlike 3 houses though, this isn't an area of effect attack, only the initial target takes damage. But if you're used to Emblem Corrin, you'll know that flames are great for slowing things down. At Bond level 3, you get Lineage, active regardless of which Lord you're on, which simply multiplies experience gained by 1.2 times. Unlike Byleth, this does not transfer to adjacent allies, only yourself. The engage skill for the three houses lords is combat arts. Each one of them has their own, and all three of them are accessible while engaged, regardless of which lord is currently leading. I'll just show them on separate pages for the sake of keeping things concise. As there's no weapon durability in engage, the cost you pay for using these is instead remaining engaged turns. And Edelgard's gives you the most hefty price, but it's well worth it. For 3 engaged turns, Raging Storm lets you take another action after combat. Be warned though, you must use Aimer if you're using Raging Storm, so when fighting something that can counterattack, you'll be forced to take a hit. Another important note about the combat arts is that you cannot put yourself out of engage with them. If you reduce your engage turns to 0, you will remain in the engage state until the start of your next player phase. The class bonuses are the same for every combat art, and they're pretty basic. Dragons get 10% more damage, and covert units get plus 20 avoid. The engage attack, Houses Unite, is the same for all 3 lords. It has you attack with Aimer, Aradbar, and Fealnaught once each at 50% damage each. Dragons deal 10% more damage for the whole attack, Cavalry, Covert, and Armored units deal 10% more damage with one of the 3 weapons, and makes me wish Dimitri's unique promotion back in 3 houses was Cavalry, but that's beside the point. Key Adepts automatically break the enemy, but as you're attacking with a sword, lance, and axe, that's likely anyway. But the real bonus is if you're adjacent to Byleth while using this, because then you get to take another action after the engage attack. Now remembering that if you're adjacent to Byleth, he could have used Goddess Stance on you, and that you have access to Raging Storm through this emblem, it's entirely possible to get 4 attacks in a single turn with whoever wears this bracelet. Edelgard's engage weapon is Aimer. Its stats are identical to Byleth's version, except this time non-dragons can use it. Well, friendly rivalry triggered, I guess I'm talking about the Prince of Blue Lions now. While Dimitri is active, you have access to Shield Gambit, which nullifies the first attack from ranged enemies targeting the unit for 1 turn. This is the only one of the 3 gambits that is not an attack. At Bond 10, any one of the 3 gains access to Dimitri's Aradbar while engaged. Its stats once again are the same as Byleth's version. Dimitri's combat art is Atrocity. It only costs 1 engage turn, and it simply lets you attack with double might. You must use Aradbar, and it's available even if you haven't unlocked it. This is just a solid all-purpose kill enemy button. And now the legendary Upside Down Man himself. Claude's Gambit is Poison, which poisons the enemy and all adjacent foes after combat. Good if you have multiple tough foes clustered together, but it's best on bosses. At Bond 15, you get access to Fealnaught, my favourite of the 3 engage weapons, as it's a 2 to 3 range bow with a good critical rate. Claude's combat art is Fallen Star, costs 1 engage turn, and it essentially makes you invincible to the next enemy that attacks you. But as it forces you to use Fealnaught, there has to be an enemy 2 to 3 spaces away from where you're currently standing. Back to Edelgard, because there's one more unlockable sync skill I have to go over. DLC emblems can go all the way up to Bond 20 from the moment you acquire them. No special unlocks required. So at Bond 12, and an upgraded version at Bond 17, you get Weapons Sync, another complicated skill, granting attack plus 5 or plus 7 if you initiate combat with the same weapon type as your synced emblem. If you're engaged, you gain the bonus regardless of what weapon you're using and regardless of who your emblem is. But for the Emblem of Rivals, you need to match whichever lord is currently leading. Axes for Edelgard, lances for Dimitri, or bows for Claude. If you inherit this skill though, every emblem has a pre-assigned weapon type for weapon sync, and the vast majority of them are swords. It is interesting that Eirika and Ephraim change their weapon syncs based on which is active though. The Emblem of Rivals at its max level gives a pretty good plus 5 strength, along with plus 4 dex and plus 3 defense. Along with all its other bonuses, this is an emblem well suited to a good all-round physical attacker. Giant skill inheritance bio go! I saw no need to split this one up since everything's available from the start. For its stat boost, you get Strength and Dex Plus. For boosting 2 stats, this is fittingly expensive at higher tiers. Instead of a weapon bonus, you get Bow Guard, which reduces damage taken from enemies with bows. Probably won't save flyers from destruction, so save this for someone else who doesn't like ranged attacks. But as for sync skills, Lineage is pretty cheap, and if you don't mind using DLC early on, put this on someone early and watch them snowball. Weapon sync is a nice damage boost, though it is expensive to inherit. And finally, the bizarre skill that is Assembly Gambit. Since the other 3 gambits rely on having Edelgard, Dimitri, or Claude active, they had to invent an entirely new gambit for having none of them, making this a rare command skill totally exclusive to inheritance. Most people don't think it's that great though. You might find the occasional use for dragging an enemy back 1 tile, but it's hardly game-changing. This emblem also grants access to axe, lance, and bow proficiency, potentially at a point in the game where that's difficult. For being the one DLC emblem you don't have to work for, the Emblem of Rivals is very strong. With Emblem Tiki, you too can enjoy the dragon transformation that Aaliyah wishes they had. Tiki's most notable qualities come into play while engaged, but first I'll go over her sync skills. Star Sphere is the most infamous, as it adds 15 to all her users' growth rates, including build, where 15% is a huge deal. Geosphere at Bond 3 gives a defense and resistance buff to the user and all adjacent allies for 1 turn if there are adjacent allies, which can provide a small boost to durability. Life Sphere at Bond 8 restores 20 HP to the user if they use weight, but more importantly, heals their status. And at Bond 10, you get Light Sphere, halving the foe's crit rate when initiating combat. The issue is, Tiki already boosts luck significantly, and in the original Mystery of the Emblem, this completely prevented enemy criticals. Usually when you face enemies with crit rates in Engage, they're fairly low anyway, and changing a 5% into a 2% is still gonna make you salty when you get unlucky. But again, it's her Engage skill that's the most notable. Draconic Form turns her user into a dragon while engaged. In practice, this means you get HP plus 10, build plus 5, and all other basic stats plus 5. The plus 5 on speed is especially significant. Armored units also gain immunity to terrain damage, while mystical units get resistance plus 10 instead of 5. The trade-off with this is that you cannot use your own weapons while engaged. Instead, you'll be using Tiki's engage weapon, which I'm showing here in lieu of her engage attack, which I'll cover later. Everyone has access to Eternal Claw, a high crit rate melee weapon, and Tail Smash, a high might smash melee weapon. But every other class type gets its own type of breath. All of these have the effect of acting like a smash weapon, but not actually pushing the enemy, so they strike last and can't double attack. They also have identical might, accuracy, and weight. They also treat the enemy's relevant defensive stat as if it was half its usual value. Totally ignoring defense is sadly an exclusive privilege of enemy dragons. Most units get Fire Breath, which is just the standard one with no additional effects. Dragons get Fog Breath from Tiki's Divine Dragon form in Mystery of the Emblem, which is effective against dragons and creates fog tiles. Armored units channel Ice Dragons and get a breath that freezes foes. Flying units get the Flame Breath of Mystery of the Emblem's Wyverns, that hits a wider area but at less damage. And mystical units get the Dark Breath of Mage Dragons, which is a magical attack but otherwise has no additional effects. You can kill multiple enemies at once with these, and some of the bonus effects, in particularly Area Freeze from Armored and creating Fog for Dragons, can be really nice. And that's not even getting into Tiki's Engage attack. Divine Blessing does not do any damage, instead it grants an adjacent ally a revival stone. This works the same way that multiple health bars do for enemy bosses, including the fact that if an enemy breaks your revival stone, you don't get to counterattack that combat. But still, there are infinite possibilities to having an extra life on one of your characters. You could also think of it as doubling their HP. But wait, there's more! For dragons, they also restore 20 HP to that ally, key adepts also heal their status effects, and if Marth is adjacent, you get potentially one of the most hilarious emblem team-up effects in the game. Seriously, when I first read this, I did a double take and wondered if it was even real. If ally is not synced, fully restore HP. If synced, +3 to engage meter. If engaged, restores engage turns. This can result in powerful engage forms like Ike's or Roy's going even longer than usual. Additionally, using this with the 13th Emblem's Engage Plus will refresh the engage turns of both characters in the pair. At higher bond levels, only 2 of her sphere skills upgrade. Leif's sphere just restores more HP, 30 at bond 14 and 40 at bond 19, while Geosphere raises its buff from +3 to +5 defense and resistance. Tiki's final stat bonuses are +10 HP, +4 defense, and +10 luck. Between that and her dragon form, she makes her user incredibly bulky. Tiki's inheritance is somewhat notable for being the only way to get art proficiency before you get Byleth after chapter 14. And also for Inheritable Star Sphere. For maximum benefit, you want to get this as soon as possible. Her stat bonus is HP and Luck Plus, making you bulky and resistant to criticals, and her guard skill is Special Guard, which mostly affects breath, any weapons that don't count as a specific other weapon type. Her other inheritance is just the sphere skills, and of them, Life Sphere is nice for a buffer against status. Overall, Tiki has amazing support synergy with Marth, along with letting anyone be a fairly strong but one-range locked combat unit. Think of Hector as an alternative tanking emblem to Ike, and very much like his own game, but atypical of Engage, he is all about that enemy phase. Unlike Ike, his user wants to stay at high HP, because at above 80%, his first sync skill, Quick Riposte, allows them to always double attack on the enemy phase, provided they're not using a smash weapon or thunder or something like that. Obviously, this is better on slower characters who would not otherwise be doubling, as it won't make someone who's already doubling attack more times. Important note about Quick Riposte, unlike in Three Houses, it doesn't stop the enemy from doubling, it just makes you double. If the enemy has a speed lead of 5 points or more, both sides will end up double attacking. At Bond 3 you get Adaptability, which raises defense by 2 or resistance by 2 based on whether you just took a physical or magical attack. This lasts for the rest of the battle, but it will reset if you're attacked again, so only one of these can be active at any time. At Bond 8, Hector channels the woes of every enemy in his home game with heavy attack, encouraging you to wield weapons much higher than your weight class. For every point your weapon's weight exceeds your build, you deal +1 damage to a maximum of +5. Now, if you're looking at the rest of this bio, you'll notice one serious problem with this skill. Hector himself raises build, which makes it a little counterintuitive on him, though it can be inherited to characters not using him. It's often said that this can benefit Tamara, but that's probably not a point in her favour. While engaged, Hector bestows the skill Impenetrable, which grants defense and resistance plus 30% when the enemy initiates combat. Again, all about that enemy phase tanking. Armored units get plus 50% defense instead of 30, and flyers get plus 50% resistance instead of 30, though they still get the plus 30% to the other defensive stat. Cavalry units get immunity to freeze, while dragons get a pretty nice critical avoid plus 50, which in practice means almost nothing can crit them. His engage attack is Storm's Eye, and much like Ike, This is a skill that you use to move into position and dig in for the enemy phase, rather than unleashing an immediate attack, though it works a bit differently. Instead of striking at the end of the turn, you instead get break immunity, and whenever an enemy attacks you, they cannot double you, but you will always double them. Again, good on low speed characters who would otherwise be taking a lot of double attacks, or would not be doubling themselves. Dragons get to prevent one critical hit, which in practice, not much is going to get through that plus 50 critical avoid anyway. Backup units get crit plus 20 to their own attacks, actually very nice when you're always hitting twice. Coverts get avoid plus 30, which is a little redundant with the boost to defenses Impenetrable is giving you. And if Lyn is adjacent, you strike before the enemy counterattacks, and always double. Though if Lyn's user is adjacent, they're probably a more tempting target for enemies than Hector's user would be, so you'll need a strategy to make sure they still go for Hector. Though I already see potential in using this on a low resistance armored unit, tempting foolish AI mages into attacking and getting one-shotted before they have a chance to strike. For engaged weapons, Hector brings the classic Wolf Bale, which has the exact same stats it did on Game Boy Advance, effective against cavalry and armored units, and a nice amount of might for an effective weapon. At Bond 10, he gives a rune sword? This weapon is weird in how it works, and the game doesn't really explain it. Despite hitting on the enemy's resistance stat like a magic weapon, it actually bases its damage off half of the user's strength instead of their magic, encouraging you to use Hector on physical units and not mages. And draining HP does work well with his tanking skills and keeping Quick Riposte in effect. Speaking of which, Quick Riposte only requires 60% HP or more at Bond level 16, at Bond level 19, Adaptability's boost improves to plus 3 defense or resistance, but at Bond level 12 you get a new sync skill that is very interesting, Piercing Glare. You must be at full health to use this, and it consumes 20% of your max HP. But when used, it makes all spaces diagonally adjacent to the user, so up to 4, impassable to enemies. There's several uses for this, from protecting vulnerable allies to sealing off entire avenues of attack. Get creative. And for his Bond 15 weapon, what else but the legendary Lightning Helicopter Axe Armads. Great might, good accuracy for an axe, 18 weight but that may be a strength with heavy attack, defense on top of the bulk he already gives you, and as much as I like to rag on dragon effectiveness, if you've got Hector you've got the DLC, and the DLC maps are full of phantom worms and phantom wyverns, which are weak to dragon slaying weapons. Stupid fell dragon corrupted worms. Hector's stat bonuses cap out at plus 4 strength, plus 5 defense, and plus 3 build. For Hector's inheritance, he obviously gives axe proficiency but nothing else, and his stat bonus is strength and defense. Great, but very expensive. His guard skill is Axe Guard, but the rest of his inheritance is mainly notable for Quick Riposte. Its cost is fairly achievable via SP books, and it can be decent for someone who sees a lot of enemy phase but has trouble doubling. There's also Heavy Attack, which can be okay on people with build issues, I guess, and also Adaptability. Although it might not seem like much, it's very cheap to get. What's notable though is what's missing. You can't inherit Piercing Glare, so Hector's Bracelet Holder has that unique ability to shut down enemy movement. Overall, Hector is geared towards luring and tanking on the enemy phase. The problem is, this is not something Engage's map design encourages, so you may have to work to find decent uses for him. Soren might be lost in his books, but he'll always have us to watch his back. As you might expect, he's a heavily magic-focused emblem, boosting magic, dexterity, and resistance. His first sync skill, Assign Decoy, makes one ally more likely to be targeted by enemies, though it wears off if they're attacked or otherwise damaged 3 times. At Bond 4, he gets Anima Focus, which grants a debuff effect to each of the 3 basic types of magic, fire, thunder, and wind, This also affects his engage attack, meaning it will apply all 3 of these debuffs once you're at least Bond 4. And at Bond 9 you get Keen Insight, dealing 5 extra damage when hitting a weakness with an effective weapon. Though this itself is not multiplied by the weakness, it's just added afterwards. When engaged with Soren, every time you attack with a tome, you treat the enemy's resistance as if it was 20% lower, and you recover HP equal to half the damage dealt, all the damage dealt if you're a key adept. Mystical units treat resistance as if it's 30% lower, and dragons get the interesting effect of having their crit rate doubled. If only there was a dragon unit who liked to use tomes. Maybe this effect would be great on them. Soren's engage attack hits a plus-shaped area around the target, so in practice just them and those adjacent, with a fire, thunder, and wind attack at 40% damage each. The wind hit is effective against flyers, and will therefore get the damage boost from Keen Insight if you have that. Dragon units set the terrain on fire, Mystical deal 10% more damage, Key Adept gives a 20% chance of break, while having Ike adjacent expands the area of effect to a 3x3 square centered on the target. Soren's first engage weapon is an interesting one. Bolting is one of the rare ways to attack from extreme range without Lyn, but it pays a hefty price. Very low might, very low hit rate, and it can't even double. But if you've got a way to raise its accuracy, this can be nice for picking off enemies from a distance, or for aggroing things the same way Lyn's Astrostorm can. At Bond 10, you get a staff effect that wasn't even in the Tellius games. It bestows a buff that causes allies to reflect 50% of magic damage they take back to the foe for 1 turn. As you'll see in Soren's paralogue, I feel like this skill is better in the hands of the enemy than it is for you, because you need to have a very low resistance character exposed to mages and take a lot of damage to get the biggest benefit out of it. At higher Bond levels, Soren's stat boosts cap out at +4 magic, +3 dex, and +5 resistance. Not the highest magic boost in the game, but still solid. At Bond level 13, you get the interesting block recovery skill. If you attack a broken foe with a tome, there's a percentage chance equal to your speed minus the foe's speed times 5, to a maximum of 50%, that they will remain broken. This is one of the few ways that break can be maintained across multiple combats. So if you have an enemy that takes a lot of punishment and you don't want to be eating counterattacks from them, this can help, although it's not great on maddening bosses as most of them are immune to break. At Bond 18, Keen Insight upgrades to its plus version, having you deal +7 damage for effectiveness. His Bond 15 weapon is Rexcalibur, which has solid might, effectiveness against flying units, and a massive 105 base hit, which I believe is the highest of any weapon in the game, excluding a few of Sombron's attacks. And Surge, obviously. For inheritance, Soren's stat bonus is magic and resistance plus. Even though resistance boosts are usually cheap, the fact that it also includes a magic boost makes this one really expensive. His guard skill is Magic Guard, which might actually have its uses on someone like a general. If you're getting doubled, that's -10 total damage, and that could be life-saving. All of Soren's sync skills are also inheritable. And Anima Focus is fairly cheap for what it does for you. Keen Insight could also be nice if you've got someone who's falling just short of one-shotting enemies with effectiveness. Block Recovery is also not too expensive, but bear in mind it is only useful on tome users. If it worked with any weapon, I'd assume its SP cost would be at least double this. Finally, Soren provides Knife Proficiency, a reference to sages in Path of Radiance having that as an option, lame though it was, Staff Proficiency, and Tome Proficiency all the way at Bond level 16. Yeah, Soren really makes you work for that, but it's in character. You're much better off getting that from Celica or Micaiah. Overall, Soren is a good all-round emblem to give to tome users, especially those without Levin swords, while bringing some neat tactical tricks to the table. She of fan service and a billion heroes ults. But Camilla is the only real dedicated flyer emblem in Engage. And her first sync skill is also interesting. It's Dragon Vein, and most of its effects are the same as Corrin's, but they have different area of effects. There are two exceptions though. Covert units with Camilla instead create smoke that decreases avoid and defense. It's the same kind of tiles we saw in Soren's Divine Paralogue, while key adepts create the ice floor from Tiki's Paralogue instead of ice pillars. And in my opinion, this is a massive improvement. Why didn't Cedol get this in Chapter 15? I'll be covering her other sync skills in the second half, because first, her engaged skill Soar is kind of a mini Sigurd, with the addition that you get to cross terrain as if your movement type was flying, and you don't even get a bow weakness for this. The dragon effect for this is a reference to Camilla's Savage Blow skill from Fates, dealing area of effect percentage damage to foes after combat. Cavalry units get an extra move +2, while flyers get move +1, although, since they can already fly over terrain, I'd more recommend this on cavalry. Her engaged skill, Dark Inferno, doesn't deal any increased damage over a normal attack, unless you're a mystical unit, but it does hit a 12-tile checkerboard area and set them all on fire. Dragons get an increased area, key adepts add glow tiles to adjacent spaces, and if Corrin is adjacent, the missing tiles in the checkerboard pattern are filled in, creating a 20-tile rectangle of fire. Camilla's first engage weapon is a magic axe that is not a smash weapon. Unfortunately, it still comes with a penalty, avoid -20. But having a strong magic axe that can double and doesn't strike last may be worth it. And what's also worth it is her Bond 10 weapon, Lightning. It's weak, but it is essentially a magic brave weapon that is an S rank like Nova. At Bond 4, Camilla gets the sync skill Decisive Strike, which deals 5 damage to the foe after combat if you initiate and land a critical. This skill is a lot better than I thought it was, as I just found out it actually can kill things. And as its damage comes after combat, it has the niche use of getting around skills like Hold Down. The Bond 8 skill Detoxify cures the user of poison, no matter how many stacks, at the start of the turn. Similar to Tiki's Life Sphere, except it doesn't require you to wait, but it also only works on poison. The Bond 12 skill is the real prize in my opinion, though I hate the fact that this is locked behind DLC. If a unit with Groundswell ends its turn on a type of dangerous terrain like flames or miasma, you clear the effect and recover 10 HP. This makes chapters 15 and 19 a whole lot more manageable if you have the DLC. At Bond 18, you get Decisive Strike Plus, which deals 10 damage to the foe after combat if you get a critical, and 10 damage, now that's a more significant number. Her Bond 15 weapon is a pretty good one. Camilla's axe has equivalent power and accuracy to the regular S-ranked axe, but is also a lot lighter, and gives you resistance +10, and deals extra damage equal to the foe's resistance minus their defense, so making it pretty good against mages. Her stat boosts cap out at +7 HP, +5 speed, which is really nice, and +4 resistance. As she doesn't boost any offensive stats, it's best to make sure she's on someone whose strength or magic is already high. Camilla's skill inheritance might look a little bare, and that's mostly because Dragon Vein is not inheritable. Her stat boost is speed and resistance plus. Not that expensive given that it boosts speed, though it's probably more efficient to just get Lynn's speed +5, you're unlikely to also need the resistance. Lance Guard may be decent though, it's fairly cheap at max level and there are a lot of lance using enemies in the game. Decisive Strike is pretty cheap, though I'd rather make a crit build that outright kills things. But Detoxify and Groundswell are very cheap for what they do. 250 SP for effective immunity to poison is not that bad. And if you have Camilla, you probably want to spread Groundswell around just to make chapters 15 and 19 more bearable. Groundswell can also do some fun things in Chapter 17 with all the flames on that map. But overall, Camilla's biggest asset, no, I totally did not mean to make a joke there, but anyway, Camilla's biggest asset is the +2 movement and effective flyer movement type. Between her and Sigurd, you've got one person with crazy movement, and one person with not quite as crazy movement, but who can ignore terrain. And both are amazing. The first and only emblem from a spin-off game, Veronica brings with her the power of gacha. Thankfully, no microtransactions required. I'm gonna start by jumping the gun on Bond's skills because Book of World deserves its own slide. Think of this as an evolving effect that gets stronger the more turns a character uses weight without attacking. It advances by one stage each time, and every stage includes all the previous stages. Wait the full 5 turns and you'll get ally healing, self-healing, damage the foe after combat, setting their space on fire, and freezing the foe. Though you can use dancing to get multiple weights in a single turn. But the first effect, freeze, is pretty easy to access and arguably its most useful one. But Veronica's main gimmick requires you to be engaged. First is her engaged skill, Contract. This grants another action to an ally, with the caveat that they cannot move during this action. So it's not quite as effective as a Dance, Goddess Dance, or Raging Storm. The difference is, you can combine this with all of those. +1 to the potential actions of the Emblem of Rivals. Dragons give the ally an all stats buff during the action, Coverts buff the hit and avoid of that ally, and backup units have Veronica's unit participate in a chain attack during the ally's action. This is an amazing skill, like anything that grants extra actions. But don't forget Veronica's engage attack, Summon Hero. When you use this, you choose a type of summoning stone, red for swords, blue for lances, green for axes, and colourless for everything else, and roll on that gacha. There's a 30% chance of summoning a base class fabrication 2 levels below the user, a 40% chance of a promoted fabrication at the user's level, and a 30% chance of an emblem 2 levels higher than the user. The game already had combat data for the emblems that's used in the arena and in their paralogs, but now's your chance to actually use those emblems. Regardless of what type it is, Veronica's summon is fully controllable and lasts until it either dies or until Veronica's engage wears off. That's important to remember. It can't gain experience, but it can do anything a normal unit can, and unlike the rest of your army, it's completely expendable. Think of it as one of Lynn's clones, except it can actually move. There's a ton of uses for this, even the weak 3-star summons. Speaking of which, the game says that dragons summon a powerful unit, but what this means is they remove 3 stars from the pool and add the 3-star rate to the 4-star rate. For backups, the summoned unit has the dual strike skill, though many summoned emblems are already backup units, so depending on what you get, this might be useless. Cavalry though, add move +1 to the summon, which is always useful. And would you believe me if I said I haven't even covered the most broken aspect of Veronica yet? Because her Bond 1 sync skill is the absolutely disgusting Reprisal. If unit's HP is not full, adds 30% of lost HP to attack. Remember, this is attack, not damage, which means if you get a critical, this amount is multiplied. I have seen absolutely bonkers damage from this on an Ike Vantage Wrath build. Oh, and at Bond 18, this now adds 50% of your lost HP to attack. Oh, and Veronica can also boost your level, because why not? And at Bond 13, you get 20 more SP for every enemy you defeat, even without a ring or bracelet equipped, which makes it even easier to inherit her ridiculously broken skills. Oh, and to the surprise of no one, her engaged weapons are also broken. The first one is, and excuse me for not speaking Old Norse, I think this is pronounced Hlithskjalf? While it might look like a staff, it's treated as a tome for game mechanics, And if you initiate combat with it, the enemy can't counterattack, because Veronica. And at Bond 10, you get Fortify Plus, a staff with effectively infinite uses that restores HP for all allies in range and also cures their status, something regular Fortify can't even do. And at Bond 15, you get Elevaga. It means ice waves in Norse. It's pretty powerful, and it also nullifies any stat buffs on the foe for one turn. Veronica's stat bonuses cap out at +4 resistance, +6 luck, and +5 magic, tied for the highest magic boost in the game. For inheritance, the main thing you should be concerned with is reprisal, because again, that is disgusting. It's expensive to inherit, but it's very well worth it if you have manuals. I was also very surprised to find Book of Worlds was inheritable. SP conversion is also a tempting inheritance. Just remember that you need to defeat 15 enemies with it equipped in order to make back the skill's cost. Her stat bonus is Magic and Dex Plus, which may be useful on Ivy. And her guard skill is Knife Guard. Enemies with knives are deceptively hard hitting, so this might be more useful than you'd think. In terms of proficiencies though, Veronica is very outclassed. Micaiah gives staves far earlier, and everyone gives tomes earlier. But that tiny hiccup won't stop Veronica from being one of the most broken emblems in the game. Emblem Chrom. Oh, and Robin's here too. Unlike the emblems of the Sacred and Rivals, Robin is more of an Knuckles style addition than an emblem in his own right, though Veronica can still summon him. Chrom and Robin are an all-round physical and magical emblem with a varied skill set that every character will at least appreciate part of, but few can appreciate all of. Their first sync skill, Surprise Attack, is great on covert units, as it means if you attack from terrain with an avoid bonus, the foe can't counter. At Bond level 4, you get Robin's famous Rally Spectrum, though it only affects adjacent allies at this point. It's still a pretty good all-round stat boost. And at Bond level 8, you get Brute Force. I never knew Chrom was flak. The game simply says this makes criticals do increased damage. It actually boosts their damage by 33%, which is pretty significant, though it only affects physical weapons. Their engaged skill, Other Half, has two distinct effects. Firstly, it gives magic plus 10 while the engage is active. Now this is probably meant to make physical units capable of doing actual damage with Robin's magic weapons, but in practice, it also makes already powerful mages even better. The second effect is that Robin will chain attack in every one of the user's combats, and if you're a dragon, Robin chain attacks twice. This still has the usual 80% chain attack accuracy, but if they both hit, this essentially means everything you attack has 20% less health. Backup units don't even have to worry about the chain attack accuracy, every enemy they fight has 10% less health, and coverts get move plus 1 while engaged. Their engage attack is either extremely powerful or extremely pathetic, depending on who you are and what you're fighting. It doesn't deal any extra damage or have any special effects. It's simply an attack using physical power that hits the enemy's resistance stat. But the effects of Robin's Ignis are represented by the dragon and mystical bonuses. Dragons deal damage equal to half their strength, while mysticals deal extra damage equal to half their magic. Flyers add their build to the damage, which can be okay if you have a very bulky flyer, while if Lucina is adjacent, all adjacent allies will chain attack. Chrom, or at this point Robin's, engage weapons are the Levin Sword, which is weaker than the normal weapon version found in Engage, but then there's Thoron, which is very different from the normal version found in Engage, because this one is not long range, just restricted to 1 to 2, but it can double attack. For higher Bond levels, at 13 you get Charm, which raises the accuracy of chain attacks you instigate to 90%, including Robin's chain attack while engaged. And at Bond 18, Rally Spectrum becomes a true rally skill, affecting all allies within 2 spaces. You also get Chrom's Bond 15 weapon, Falchion, yet another variant of this, and it's yet another Engage weapon that's effective against dragons, which is not the best due to how Engage handles them. Corrupted worms not counting as dragons and all that. Chrom and Robin's bonuses cap out at +3 strength, +5 dexterity, and +4 speed, a nice bonus to have on a physical attacker. For inheritable skills, their stat boost is speed and dex, and their guard skill is Sword Guard. Swords aren't the most powerful weapons, especially in the enemy's hands, so I don't see this being very useful. Surprise Attack is inheritable, but it's insanely expensive. Though if you have the DLC and you're using Yunaka, she probably wants this. Rally Spectrum and Brute Force are a little expensive, but are nice to have. Especially since it only costs 500 extra SP to upgrade to the better version of Rally Spectrum once you're at Bond 18. Charm is also an option, and may be nice if you're using Boucheron, since his personal skill already gives him bonuses when people chain attack in his combats. Just remember this won't affect chain attacks from the unit, only chain attacks they trigger. Finally, Chrom gives sword proficiency at Bond 6, though that's hardly a rare one, and Robin... what is it with DLC emblems and giving tone proficiency at Bond 16? Though admittedly, sources of it are rare after Chapter 11. Overall, for the last DLC emblem, Chrom and Robin are unfocused, and there aren't many people who can benefit from their entire kit. But the magic +10 while engaged can be very strong.